If we could just have this one goal that we like say over and over and over again, Jesse, we are trying to stop the disaster after the disaster. And we don't want your family to be on that list.
All right, I am joined today by Gail Williams, the Executive Director of California Communities Against Toxics, to discuss the unfortunate realities of air quality in Los Angeles as a result of the Los Angeles fires. Jane, thank you for being on Urgent Futures.
Thank you very much for the invitation. I appreciate it.
Yeah. I guess the first place to start is what's in our air right now?
Well, after the car fire in Northern California, a health hazard evaluation was done to answer just that question. And what they found in the air were asbestos and silica and lead and arsenic and cadmium and polyaromatic hydrocarbons and dioxins and furans. And I don't think they checked for PCBs, but you could imagine if dioxins and furans are there, PCBs are probably there too. They're created as a combustion byproduct of combustion, right? So urban fires are different than wildfires that happen in forests, because you're not just burning trees and brush. You're burning lead acid batteries, you're burning asbestos piping, you're burning the electrical infrastructure in your house, you're burning copper pipe that's in your house, or asbestos pipe. Depends very much on how old your house is, how old the building is that's being burned. Like in Altadena, a lot of those homes, the people who have called me from Altadena, and I was in Altadena a couple of weeks before the fire, and I noticed that many of the homes, were probably 100 years old. So, you've got a different suite of things, and now our houses contain a lot of plastic, so you burned a lot of plastic. So from the health hazard evaluation that was done in the car fire, we have a pretty good idea what's in the air. And we also are going to have a much better idea too. Not a better idea, but we know that that's in the ash. And when we start moving all that ash, we're going to re-entrain that in the air.
And I think a lot of people know, they hear asbestos or something like that, and asbestos, formaldehyde, lead, cadmium, all these things. They hear these words, they know, okay, that's bad. But why exactly is it bad? What are the health effects of those pollutants?
So let me put this in perspective from what we know. And so we've had the post 9/11, we had the Twin Tower catastrophe. And we have a lot of information from that disaster. And then we've had, the car fire, Paradise, Camp Fire. But the longest amount of time that's passed from a major urban fire in the generation that you're a part of is post 9/11. And so here's what we know. We know that 400,000 people were impacted from the debris in the air from that fire. And of course, that disaster wasn't just a fire. It's like that disaster was just a few square miles, right? And so of those 400,000 people, 138,000, a quarter, more than a quarter, are now a part of the health registry, meaning they have some sort of impact from the fire. Whether it is COPD, whether it is cancer, whether it is post-traumatic stress syndrome, whether they've had a stroke. Of course, a number of those people have died, right? A number of the people that were first responders or workers that went in, right? So we know in Los Angeles now that we have a significantly higher amount of people that are being exposed both to trauma and to air pollution and to these toxic compounds. And as people call me and they ask me what to do, I try to put this in perspective, right? Your job is to not be on that list. You don't want to be on that list. You don't want to be part of the Los Angeles fire post-disaster health surveillance program. You're trying to do everything you can to avoid exposure. And the exposure to the ash is just as toxic as exposure to breathing the air, right? Or, drinking contaminated water. And so it is very important to know that we do have a pretty good idea of what to do to avoid exposures, primarily because of the lessons learned post 9/11 and primarily the post car fire, because we do have that health hazard evaluation. And like we took like wipe samples of workers' faces and their hands and their necks, right? And so we can see from those wipe samples like what was on their faces, metals and polyaromatic hydrocarbons, asbestos, silica. So we know that that's in their breathing zones. So I hope that why do we care about this? Because 20 years from now, you'll have this whole suite of unavoidable public health impacts that they're not fixable. You can't really like fix COPD. You cannot fix, you got asbestos in your lungs, now you have mesothelioma. Like, these, I could go on about these different things, right? And so the best thing we can do right now is to stop the disaster after the disaster. And it's very simple. You're not talking about, move to some other state. You're talking about, wait, like common sense stuff. Should I send my kid back to school in the ash zone? My school was saved. Fantastic. Let's put the kids back in the middle of the ash, which is what they did post 9/11 and what they did in the Lahaina fire. They inexplicably, we have this society that wants to maintain and reestablish normalcy. And part of that is getting our kids back to school as quick as possible. It's some sort of sociological factor that we see in disasters. I've seen it in chemical disasters. We saw it post 9/11. We saw it in Lahaina, where FEMA literally rebuilt a school next to the ash piles, even though families had been relocated like 15 miles away into these huge hotels in Maui. They brought the kids back to the ash piles. And then you're putting, just to keep going, you're putting educators in this horrible position of not educating, but trying to manage industrial hygiene with putting filters in classrooms and keeping kids with masks on their faces and not allowing kids to go out when there's wind. And like you're turning principals and teachers into industrial hygienists like overnight. And that's not their role. And like we shouldn't be doing that as a society. We should pause and think, wait, does this make sense? Should I be sending my kids back into ash zones, right?
Yeah. It is also making me think about the fact that, I know a good number of folks who've lost their homes and they're already in dialogue with their insurance companies, and their insurance companies are demanding that they rebuild in the exact same place where the fire occurred, which for so many reasons feels problematic. I mean, if people want to sort of make that choice with their life, they should be able to, but they should also have the option to rebuild somewhere else, even within Southern California. You brought up the ash zone. What is the ash zone from these fires so far? Obviously, asterisk here that this could change because the fires are still active, but like what area are we talking about in Southern California?
Well, last I looked, it's over 50 square miles. And like you think, well, is that a lot or is that like not much or like what is that, right? So um when we dropped the bomb on Hiroshima, that obliterated 1 square mile. Just to kind of put things in perspective, like how big is this, right?
Mm.
It's like, you're in a war zone now. Like that's the magnitude that we're looking at. The Chicago fire, 3 square miles. The Great Chicago Fire, 3 square miles. And what's going to end up being the final tally, I don't know.
And is it constrained to where the fires have burned, or is it in neighboring areas where fire hasn't burned, but there's proximity?
No, that's what area that figure is what's been burned, right?
Got it.
Right. And so some of what's burned is, like canyons, right, with hiking trails and bushes and trees. But a significant portion of what's been burned is a city. Like we've burned a city to the ground. And I want to warn you, like I know you're trying to wrap your head around it. I've talked to like a number of people and they're worried about their kids. They're worried about their family and that should be their number one thing, right? And a lot of people still that I've talked to, they cannot conceptualize how large this catastrophe is, right? Like I think the economist in me is like, okay, where are we at? And like, I've seen estimates. I think Goldman put out an estimate, like we're touching on $300 billion, which is like larger than many economies of countries to rebuild.
Yeah.
And you are literally looking at almost like an act of war where you've just burned so much of a city to the ground. So it is very, there's a great podcast that I saw this morning from a psychiatrist down from University San Diego, University of California, San Diego. And she was talking about how people are still in shock. They really don't even understand like yet the magnitude of what's occurred. And like one of the significant impacts when you have trauma and shock is that your prefrontal cortex, your executive functions don't work as well. It's hard like to make decisions. And I want to warn people about that. As I was listening to that this morning, these insurance companies are coming in and saying, make decisions now, make decisions now. And like, no, nobody should be making any big decisions now. Nobody. Because she even talked about, even if you weren't impacted, but you're watching it, we're all traumatized just from watching it, right?
Yeah.
Right. I mean, you're here doing a podcast. I'm trying to respond to, all these different, government agencies and requests for help and, talking to people that are, really, their houses are burned to the ground. Their children are torn out of their schools. They don't have a place to move to, it's really difficult, but like try not to make any really big decisions. Like stay out of the ash zones and try not to let people pressure you into, you got to decide right now if you're rebuilding your house. No. Your house, if your house burned down, do you know that in Lahaina, it's like 2 years. We're looking at 2 years before you could possibly rebuild your house. They have to go and take all the hazardous chemicals, propane tanks, lithium ion batteries, lead acid batteries, pesticide cans, cleaning fluids, all that has to be removed first. Then they're going to go in, they're going to take all the scrap metal, whether it's cars or whether beams or whatever, they're going to remove all that. And only then are they going to start saying, okay, now we're going to come in and remove the ash. And the magnitude of the ash removal is like a civil engineering project that is difficult to imagine.
Yeah.
Absent an act of war, right?
Yeah.
You're just the magnitude of the cleanup. So if you're listeners, do not let people pressure you into making these big decisions right now. Your house is not going to be rebuilt this year.
To that point, the civil engineering involved, I remember on the webinar where I first encountered your work, we actually aren't even equipped for that civil engineering feat. Could you talk about that?
First of all, one of the largest landfills in LA County was just shut down January 1st, Chiquita Canyon. So like it cannot accept waste anymore. So, and the other thing is you have these fires that are like not far apart, but apart. So you can imagine the amount of material, like I have not sat down and calculated the amount of material that they're going to have to remove, but it's square miles and they probably are going to like remove like say the top foot. And I work on the Exide cleanups, and that's like 1.7 square miles, and we're removing the top foot. And you're talking about bulldozers and trucks, continually here, right, to take this material to where it's going to be taken to. So they're probably going to try to find landfills that are closer rather than farther away, right? Because, just the economics and the truck traffic and all that. I haven't thought about what that looks like yet. Some of this material may go to Sunshine Canyon because it's kind of like in the middle, right? But you're talking about literally tens of thousands of truck trips. You're talking about needing, lots and lots of bulldozers to literally bulldoze and pick up all this contaminated ash and put it in trucks, and the trucks will have to be covered and then go to the landfill and then come back, right? So even if you're not living like in the community, if you're living along those truck routes, it's almost like, we have the port and you just have the 710 freeway that is just loaded with trucks, going to the inland empire, to the inland ports. I'm not saying you're going to have that same order of magnitude. I'd have to sit and think about how many thousands of truck trips it's going to take, but tens of thousands of truck trips to take all that ash to a landfill. And you have competing interests. It's not like the economy in Los Angeles is going to grind to a halt. Remember, California is like a country. It's the fourth largest economy in the world. It's bigger than most countries. And now you've burned down one of its major cities. But that economic activity is not going to stop. We still have the ports. Like, we are the largest port in the United States. And so you're going to compete with all those trucks that want to haul a Nike shoe or an iPad or a piece of furniture. And then the other thing to remember is, like, in the middle of COVID, we had supply chain interruptions, right? You're going to have the same thing here because you're going to have so much building material that has to come in and rebuild all this that was destroyed. Like, the price of plywood is going to go from, whatever it is now, like, to double or even triple, right? The price of a 2x4, the price of cement. So, you're going to have supply chain interruptions, and that's going to exacerbate how this material is moved around, both within the economy and physically, like, moved. Like, I would not put it past people to, like, be stockpiling plywood right now, because when they go to rebuild houses, they're going to need it, right?
Right, and theoretically, there's consumer protections, but we all know that those are easily skirted in so many different ways.
Well, you just had the city of LA not vote to restrict price gouging, right, in rent hikes.
I was unaware of this. My understanding was there was you couldn't price gouge more than 10%, so
More
they
than
voted against
10%,
that.
more than 10%. But there was, like, people were saying, like, well, wait, we know what's going to happen. Can we prevent that, right? So there's, like, a political tension. There's going to be this political tension constantly between what Naomi Klein talks about being disaster capitalism. You have these capitalistic forces that are going to come in here, and we couldn't constrain those capitalistic forces during COVID. So why do you think we're going to constrain them now?
You also talked about the impact on local farms and just soil quality in general, and also you mentioned the water supply. Can you talk a little bit about both the how ash is impacting farmland and the water supply, and also, not necessarily to ask you to speculate, but also thinking about what are the economic and societal implications of that toxification?
Well, I'm gonna say, Jesse, that I've been doing this work since 1992, so 33 years, and I learned something new during that webinar from my colleague Gina Solomon. I'm not surprised it was Gina. She's just amazing. That when you pull all the water out of a water system, you start pulling smoke in. And I'm like, I never thought of that, right? So there's going to be these things that, because of the magnitude of this, right, that we are going to be like, oh, wow, we found asbestos fibers, in farmland downwind of the fires. That's a problem, right? So you can't you can't mitigate the fact that these contaminants, like in the car fire, they found lead adsorbed onto particles 150 miles away. Now, is that like enough to make the land contaminated and food unedible? No. But until you get there, you're not really sure exactly what's happening. And remember that the Santa Ana winds that created this firestorm were blowing, like hurricane force winds, essentially, really. Like, we don't categorize it as a hurricane, but like it was hurricane force winds. So a lot of that material that was in your house that burned down, the asbestos, the silica, the heavy metals, the perfluorinateds, that stuff, now you don't know where it is, right? So we don't know what the impacts are going to be, say, on the food supply. Much less that, if you've got contaminated water, they'll start testing water, and you're not going to want to use pipelines that have been contaminated for water, to irrigate, your crops and stuff, right? So I don't know how that's going to shake out, but I'm never. I guess I've gotten to the point where I'm quite like never surprised what can be the outcome here.
Mm. Right. It's inevitably we're probably underestimating or sort of falling short in our even fatalistic projections. The other thing that I think goes unaccounted for is that the air quality index is not a comprehensive measure of air quality. Can you speak to that?
Yeah, it's really it's not a service to the public to use the air quality index at this point in time, because the air quality index doesn't see the things that are going to impact your health. The air quality index is great under normal conditions, but we are not in normal conditions. And this gives me an opportunity to again say, having responded now to a number of just horrific disasters, right, during my career, you see this societal imperative to return to normalcy. And like, I understand that. It's like a societal coping mechanism, right? And that is the precise thing that puts you in harm's way. So, Jesse, I own horses and I love horses and I ride horses, and I have been a horsewoman for literally my entire life. And the first thing about fires and horses, you kick the horse out of the barn and you shut the door. Because if you don't, the horse runs back in the barn. Okay? And this is that analogy where we want to return to what is safe to us. We want to go back in the barn, right? We want to put our kids back in the school, even though everything's burned out around it. We want to drink the water from the fountain, from the tap, because that's what we used to do. People whose homes didn't burn down, they literally, like, you could have homes on both sides of you burned to the ground, but there'll be this I want to go back to my house, right? And it's this sense that that's secure, but it's not. And that was the horrifying mistake that we made post 9/11, that we allowed these public health measures to be politicized, right? And Christy Todd Whitman, who was the head of the US EPA, declared that the air was safe based on AQI, and exposed hundreds of thousands of people to life-changing and life-threatening air pollution. And it would be just a shame to me if we allowed that to happen in Los Angeles.
Mm. So how can folks get more accurate understandings of air quality?
Well, right now, we do not have this. We do not have the ability. Well, South Coast Air Quality Management District is the agency that's in charge of air quality, and they are not moving to put out enhanced monitoring that would tell us, is there asbestos in the air? Is there silica in the air around these communities that have been impacted? They can't tell you, even though they do have multi-metal monitors. They can't tell you how much metal is in the air right now. And they cannot tell you how many PAHs are in the air right now. So, absent that, right? Like, you're better off saying, okay, I should just assume that that air, is not safe to breathe, and I should wear a mask. And, in a way, we are blessed, I hate to say it, in a way that we had COVID, right? Because if we hadn't just gone through COVID, we'd be telling, those of us trying to protect public health, we'd be saying, you need to wear a mask, you need to wear a mask. And people would be looking at us like we're crazy, right? But really now we're like, no, there's something bad in the air. It doesn't matter what it is. Could be COVID, could be the plague, could be metals, asbestos, whatever. And we're saying, put on a mask and wash your hands, right? And don't, like, if you're going to go anywhere near this ash, right? Take your shoes off and wash them before you go back in the house that you're living in. Go buy a $10 Tyvek suit off of Amazon. Walk in the ash, whatever you want to, if that's what you got to do, you got to go back and get something from your house, put that suit on, and then wrap that thing up and put it in a bag and seal it, right? Or throw it out, right? But don't wear your clothes home. Don't track back the contaminated ash to the place that you're living now. So, like, I hate to say that there's anything good that came from COVID, but at least when we're telling people to put on a mask, they're not saying, what are you talking about? I'm not going to do that, because that's not societally accepted,
Right. Right. Talk to me about the difference in efficacy of the different forms of masks people are likely to wear, starting with, cloth, bandana, like very lightweight masks, all the way up to P100s and beyond.
Right. So what we know about masking is that a P100 is probably the best mask that is like commercially available. You can go buy it on Amazon. For $120, you can buy a P100 mask. It's got the cartridges and it has like a face mask on it. So you don't have to try to put goggles over your glasses or have the goggles that are smashing your nose or all that. Like, so for $120, you can go buy a really nice set of a P100 mask with the face part that will protect your eyes, right? And the good thing about that mask is, like, it's not a disposable mask. You'll have it for the rest of your life. My son, who's a wilderness emergency medical technician, went to Lahaina and helped respond, and he bought a mask. And it's still here. He can bring it out anytime he wants, and it has disposable cartridges, right? So, like, a P100 mask, super easy to get. A Tyvek suit, $10 on Amazon. Like, spend the money to protect your public health. It's $150. And you can even reuse a Tyvek suit if you want to, right? Like, just don't take it home. Like, seal it in a bag, throw it in the back of your car. If you're going to go back again, put the Tyvek suit back on, right? Make sure your feet are covered. That's like the best advice I can give. And at the very bottom of this is like no mask at all, or some cloth mask that one of your friends made that has like little chickens on it or something, or pink unicorns. Like, that is not going to help you. That is not going to keep an asbestos fiber out of your lungs. That's going to turn into lung cancer later in life. So, like, don't look at me and say I'm wearing a mask, right? I'll never forget going with a family member during COVID, and he's got the mask on and it's over his mouth, and I'm like, that's not helping, right? But no, I don't breathe out of my nose. I'm like, COVID doesn't care where you breathe. It actually likes your nose because it's wet and it's accessible. So I'm like, if you want to wear that, which is ridiculous, by the way, like, that's not going to protect you, but put it over your nose. He's like, no, I only breathe out of my mouth. I'm like, okay, I'm done. I'm like, I'm done trying to protect your health, right? So, get a P100. N65s are pretty good if you're just going to have like a pretty short exposure.
In 65 or in 95?
N95, sorry, N95, and you know that you can get them for free at any library in Los Angeles County right now. There's other places. If you go on LA County Public Health Department, they'll have a list of other places you can get them. But an N95 is pretty good. Like, you're not going to be wearing that as a cleanup worker. I hope to God we're not going to do that again, because they need to be protected from VOCs too. So they really need a cartridge mask like the P100, right?
Can you clarify what a VOC is?
volatile organic chemical. It a P1 an N95 mask will protect you from like particulate and things like asbestos and silica, but it won't protect you from a gas that's in a gaseous form. So, like if you went into the ash right now, you went into your home right now. If you smell smoke, you smell burning plastic, you smell that, that means you're being exposed to a volatile organic compound. And that's still going to
Mm.
be in the air, in the ash. It's like when you get in a new car and you smell that new car smell, that's actually a volatile organic compound, right?
Mm.
And a P95 mask won't protect you from that.
Got it. Got it. And then thinking about, so you're talking about getting a Tyvek suit, thinking about folks who are just going about their day, maybe near a burn zone or an ash zone, but not necessarily in the ash zone. Are those clothes safe to keep wearing? Do you need to wash those clothes? Like, I think there's a lot of gray area questions folks are having right now of like, if I go on a walk 3 miles from an ash zone, are my clothes contaminated? And if they are, what do I do?
So here's what I told. Okay, so if you see ash when you're walking, you are being exposed. Okay? If you see ash, any ash. So, like, the most logical place to look is like on an exterior windowsill. If you see ash there, you know that you're in an ash deposition zone. Okay? So, you should be masked and you should assume that you will have fibers or compounds on your clothes. Okay? So, you know, I would say, and the very important thing is don't wear your shoes in the house. Just don't. I don't care where you are in LA, like right now. If just like that's such a simple thing to do, to just leave your shoes outside. Um, Even if you take a baby wipe and wash your shoes off with a baby wipe, just leave your shoes outside. Because as you're walking, your shoes are picking up particles of lead, asbestos fibers, silica fibers, particles of cadmium, particles of chromium, and you don't want to take those in your house. And unfortunately, a lot of people have carpeting in their house. Carpeting is like a sponge for these things. It absorbs it, and it's like amazingly stable to get out. It likes it in there. It likes to hang out in there, right? So, obviously, if you're living anywhere within like 5 miles of any of these ash zones, the wind's going to kick up, and that ash is just going to keep getting resuspended and redeposited, almost like a hydrologic cycle. Resuspended, redeposited, resuspended, redeposited, resuspended, redeposited. Like we know that that is the fate and transport of ash. So, like, don't let anyone tell you, "Oh no, it's over there." Like, no, it's not. And I would bet if I could go in someone's home that's like 5 miles away from the fire that was downwind, and I will find this fine layer of dust in their house. And if I took a wipe and I wiped that and I took it to a lab, I'm sure I will have a high probability of finding asbestos fibers, silica fibers, and metals, and maybe, depending if there's like a lot of plastic, perfluorinateds, or other things that come from plastic burning. And you don't,
Yeah.
and you've got this hand-mouth behavior, especially if you have kids. Kids are constantly putting their hands in their mouth, so you're wiping the surface with your hand and you're putting it in your mouth, or you're drinking a cup of coffee. And we know this from workers that work in lead smelters. We know all this hand-to-mouth behavior. We know about what's called track out, where they track lead back to their homes, poison their kids. So all this, we know this from human behaviors, and all we're trying to do is like, don't change your human behaviors, just intercept the exposure. Find ways, behavioral ways of intercepting the exposure. Try to keep all your surfaces in your house super clean. Do not walk in your house with your shoes on. If you've been somewhere where you know you've been exposed to ash, I'm sorry, take your clothes off outside. Bring them in and wash them, but take your clothes off outside. Don't track that stuff in your house. Try to keep your house like really clean. And for people who live next to ash piles, I'm telling all, rip your carpeting out. Don't even try to fight it. For the next 2 to 3 years, you do not want to fight contaminated carpeting. Just have a floor surface that is easily wet mopped. You can wet mop it every day. It takes 5 minutes to wet mop, like a your kitchen and your living room, the areas of your house that you spend most of the time in, or your office too. If you're in an office, and you're within like a few miles of these ash zones, your office is going to be constantly getting recontaminated with the ash. There is no way to avoid it.
Mm, mm. And how long is the ash going to be sort of circulating as you described outside the home?
Well, it's going to be circulating outside your home until the ash is gone. And best case scenario from other disasters that we've worked on, minimum probably 2 years. With the order of magnitude we're talking about, I would say that, it's going to be like you've basically got Altadena and parts of Pasadena, and then you've got the Palisades, right? And unfortunately, with the Palisades is the largest burned area, and you've got the offshore wind that's constantly during the diurnal cycle blowing the wind, into Los Angeles, right, from the Palisades. So as they go to pick up that ash, there's just no way to avoid really not, re-entraining it, resuspending it into the air. So until all the
Mm,
ash is gone, you have this potential to have this in your home. And so,
mm, mm.
yeah.
Well, and I also remember from the webinar something that I totally had not occurred to me was the sand on the beach.
Yeah.
Could you speak to that?
Well, the sand, I can't really speak to that because I need to go out there and we haven't had a fire of this type next to a sandy beach before. Like, even the Twin Towers, there's no beach there. Okay, you're in Manhattan.
Mm,
Okay. The car fire, the campfire, those fires were inland fires. So I'm not exactly sure what's going to happen because you have this wave cycle, right? And you've got the tides. And, we know from climate change that we've got rising levels of the seawater, right? So how much of that deposition is going to have occurred on that sand and what the fate and transport is going to be of those materials on the sand, I don't think anybody has a really good idea about that. And that's just something that we're going to have to ask, like the Coastal Commission and other folks that are looking at not, it's not about the the water quality. Like right now, you probably could find stuff in the water, but it's over time. What is that fate and transport of that sand going to look like? I really don't know, and I don't know anybody that does know.
mm, mm.
And now you
Well, you referenced.
also too,
Go ahead.
you're going to have stormwater drains. You've got eventually we're going to get rain, and if that ash is there, that ash is going to get picked up by that stormwater and then pushed into the ocean, and then it almost is like a fleur de lis where it comes back and then gets deposited on the sand from the currents, right? And so that's another issue that's going to happen when we have rain eventually.
Would you say that it's that the I totally recognize that you're saying that it's hard to know and we don't have good measurements, but I guess the question that would come to my mind, and I think a lot of folks' mind, is like, okay, so it's in the immediate future not safe to be on the beach, but how long might it continue to not be safe to go to the beach?
Well, remember, after every storm, I'm pretty sure Surfrider goes out there and captures samples, right, from the storm drains, right, and they issue warnings to surfers like don't surf today, right, and that's because of all the motor oil and the plastic and the contaminants that are normally coming off of this urban surface and going into storm drains. Well, just imagine now that you've added to that asbestos and silica and heavy metals and perfluorinateds and God, PAHs, and so um, that's just going to be the inevitable outcome here is that we're going to end up contaminating stormwater, and that stormwater all drains into the ocean. I'm sure you've seen those drains where it
Yeah.
says, "Don't dispose of X of anything here. This drains to the ocean."
Yeah. You've talked about some of the things that folks can do, like wearing a P100 when they go out, get a Tyvek suit if you're going to be anywhere near the ash zone. Let's talk about, like, say you're not near the ash zone. Obviously, Southern California is home to like 10 million people. What are the general best practices that they should be considering, both in the near and further term futures? You also brought up people, kids going back to school near ash zones. Like, if you're a concerned parent, what should you be thinking about to protect your kid? Like, what are all the kind of things that maybe people aren't thinking about right now in terms of their protection that you would encourage them to think about?
Okay, so if you are not near an ash zone, but you're say, within like you're in Silver Lake, right?
Right.
Like I would not wear my shoes indoors. I would be damp mopping my floors. I would be dusting with a damp cloth. I would become sort of like a bit of a dust maniac and keeping all the surfaces. I'd be looking at dust and going, could that be asbestos in that dust? Right? Because you're just going to have this constant deposition, resuspension, redeposition, as long as the ash is there. So that's what I would say. I would say be very wary of someone saying, oh, yeah, no problem, just send your kid back to school in the ash zone, which is happening. I've gotten dozens of calls from parents, right, about this. Remember, you as an adult can protect your breathing zone. A child cannot. A child cannot. And don't let anyone tell you anything different. We do not have masks that are approved that we know are effective for children. And that is a very serious societal problem, that you cannot protect a child's breathing zone, but yet we are going to put them on the front lines by sending them back to schools where literally there's ash next door and across the street. So even
Mm,
though, and just to say, Jesse, it's a consistent societal behavior that we do this. We did it post 9/11. We did it in East Palestine. We did it, at the ITC fire, which is one of the worst disasters, worst chemical disasters in the country's history. Within 2 days of the fire starting, they sent children back to the high school within a mile of the tanks that were still on fire. So we just have this very strange societal, it's like we want to assure ourselves that we can return to normalcy. And as part of that, we have these lifeways in our society where we send our kids to school. And that's one of the things that we do. Like we walk our dogs, we send our kids to school, like probably in other societies, you'd go out and howl at the moon, right? And so we do that. It's like we have these things that we do as a society to return to normalcy. And it's those behaviors that start the disaster after the disaster. And so I'd be like very maniacal about cleaning all the surfaces of my home. I would not be wearing my shoes inside. I would be very reticent that anyone's telling me, yeah, yeah, go ahead, send your kid back to wherever, it'll be fine. Like, no, don't. Like, listen to that voice inside your head that says that just doesn't make sense to me. Um, Other things you can do, is pay attention. We're working overtime with the LA Times, with Cal Matters, with LAIST. I think we did some work with Spanish speaking press to try to keep getting the word out, like wear a mask, mask up. We're gonna rebuild, but don't let people tell you that the air is clean because the AQI is 30. Like it has nothing to do with how much asbestos is in the air.
mm.
So I hope that helps.
Absolutely. And then thinking about, like, my heart sort of breaks. It's like I don't even know if there would be an answer you could possibly propose, but like thinking about those parents who are being told that the schools are opening in or near the ash zones, is the only option available to them to leave? Like, um, I don't know, like it just seems inhumane to be exposing children to that type of risk.
Well, like realistically, you've got two options, right? It's lead or organize. So there are a number of schools both private schools and public schools that are planning to reopen on Tuesday in ash zones or right next to ash zones. For instance, I got an email from a mom whose kid is going to go to a school starting on Tuesday, and across the street is a burned down church, right? That was, built like in the late 1800s, right? And she's asking me, is that safe? Okay, well, no, that's not safe. And there's no way to make that safe, okay? Because you cannot mask those kids. And, you know, you can put an air monitor on the school, but that's not going to tell you how much silica or asbestos or lead is in the air. And we are trying to come up with a proposal for schools, like to do wipe sampling. For instance, there's different things like you can put, like South Coast AQMD has what we call plate monitoring, where you literally put out like a plate. It's like a stainless steel glass, like it's actually a glass plate, if I remember. And you can, basically you put a plate outside, you can see the stuff like being deposited, and you can take that to a lab and you can say what's in that. But that's hard. That's hard to do. It's hard to implement. It's going to take regulatory agencies that are reticent to get involved in anything that would restrict this return to normalcy. And that's this return to normalcy is really the enemy here, right? And like I understand, parents have like really tough decisions to make, but I'm just trying to be like, and people are stressed, and people are traumatized, and people are in crisis still. But if we could just have this one goal that we like say over and over and over again, Jesse, we are trying to stop the disaster after the disaster. And we don't want your family to be on that list of the post 9/11 health surveillance, because now someone in your family has cancer, has COPD, has PTSD, has these things that are extraordinarily difficult to deal with and manage, right? Like you kind of need something to like focus yourself on. Don't be on that list. What do I need to do not to be on that list? And for some people, that's going to be like very difficult. I tell you, my heart goes out to people's whose houses, this may seem strange, but my heart goes out to people whose houses didn't burn down. Because your house burned down, you can't go back. But there's people in Altadena and in Pacific Palisades who can go back. But they are literally living in a zone that looks like it got strafed. They are living in their houses somehow were spared, and there might be 3 or 4 or 5, together, and then all around them is ash. And it's not just ash from homes. It's ash from a dry cleaner. It's ash from a car dealership. It's ash from a motorcycle repair shop. Like it's not just houses that burned down. It's smaller industrial facilities. Lots of stuff with PCB transformers. Like chemicals. That are all around you. And then you're like, okay, but I want to go home, and I can go home. And I'm like, I don't know if that's the best idea, because I don't know of a way to keep those people safe.
Yeah. I read today that I don't remember if it was in Altadena or the Palisades, but like a paint supply shop was caught up in the fire. So like whole, tons of paint went up in those flames.
Right. Like you just, people, paint is like, it's plastic. It's like a type of liquid plastic, a polymer, and a lot of perfluorinateds are added to paint. Methyl isothiazide, called MI, a chemical that's added to paint, to keep it from getting mold in it. There's chemicals in all kinds of stuff that did not necessarily get burned up in the fire, right? So, yeah.
Okay, well, this has been super, super, super informative, and I really appreciate you taking the time. I guess the sort of inverse question I would ask you is, what are your needs right now? Like if people hear this and they want to be involved in sort of helping kind of lead the change, how could they go about doing that, and how could they connect with you?
So it is a little bit difficult to connect with me, but I would urge you to go to the Coalition for Clean Air's website and sign up for their listserv. There were, I think, 7,500 people that attended the webinar that we put together in 24 hours with like a series of experts across California on the impacts of urban fires. And Dr. Joe Liu, who's a longtime personal friend and colleague of mine, the executive director of the Coalition for Clean Air, is an amazing, amazing man. They're going to be pushing information out through that listserv, right? And also pay attention to the press. You know, again, we work closely with the LA Times, with LAist, LA Public News. You know, pay attention to what you're seeing in the press about what's happening. I tell you what, Inside Climate News did a fantastic article on this topic by two journalists who live in Los Angeles, right? I'm longtime friends with Jim Brugers, who's the editor or one of the main editors at Inside Climate News. Go sign up for Inside Climate News. It looks like they've got folks, really smart reporters here in LA that are going to continue to cover this, right? Dan Ross, who writes for LA Public News, who's like an amazing journalist, you know, who won environmental journalism awards for his work on the Exide lead smelter and covers these issues. Watch him, go like him, go follow him. Tony Briscoe at LA Times is going to be really, you know, following all this. He's the clean air reporter for the Times, right? And jump on that listserv at Coalition for Clean Air. I think they have skin in the game, and they are 54-year-old organization that are one of the leading advocates in Los Angeles on clean air. So that's probably the best way to keep getting this constant feed of information that you're going to need.
Amazing. Well, Jane, thank you again. Super, super informative.
Jesse, thanks for having me, and thanks for doing this. You know, I'm not like, you know, I'm 65, so I'm not like a podcaster type of person. Like I don't normally do podcasts, but I know who Joe Rogan is. Okay, because my son listens to him, and I have spent many times like on long car trips listening to all the interesting people that he interviews. He did an amazing interview with Shayna Swan, one of my colleagues, and I was like amazed by that. So, hey, you know, fantastic that you're going to be covering this. Like you are in a zone of amazing opportunity here in a way. Like I'm always trying to make lemonade out of lemons, but we need people like you to be covering this, you know?
Oh, it's super kind. I mean, we talked about right before the call started, like, obviously this is a thing that, you know, I have skin in the game with, but it's also reflective of so many other larger societal failures. And I'm just so appreciative of the work that you've been doing over the decades. I also read that you're kind of carrying the torch that your mom was doing this work as well. So you're kind of like a generational crusader.
Yeah, along with Mark Lopez, he's from East LA. He works on the Exide lead smelter with me. His grandmother and my mom were very close. In fact, when my mom died, she made me promise I would give Juana Gutierrez, who's Mark's grandmother, her rosary beads. So yeah, and unfortunately, I do this work because the small town that I grew up in still has the state's worst childhood cancer cluster, where we had 11 children contract brain cancer and die. So
Wow.
I have a lot of skin in this game, a lot of skin in this game, Jesse, and I've spent my entire professional career protecting children from exposure to compounds and toxic chemicals, air pollution, water pollution, contaminated sites. So I appreciate the opportunity to jump on a podcast. And you know, I just want to say thank you very much for like taking this on and doing it. I think there's going to be a lot of demand for information stream that you can be part of.
Well, we'll see, and maybe as the months go on, I'll
Back around.
email you again. Yeah.
You know, if you want to interview people, there was a woman that contacted me who is like related to one of the leading pulmonologists in New York, and he told her take her two small children and leave Los Angeles. That it's a toxic waste dump, and he's a pulmonologist that spent his entire career treating first responders that were exposed to toxic chemicals from
Wow.
9/11. And I thought, man, he would be an awesome person to interview, right?
Hmm. Well, I'll try to get in touch with him.
Okay. Okay, reach out anytime, Jesse.
This podcast is edited and produced by Adam Labrie and me, Jesse Damiani. The podcast is presented by Reality Studies. You can learn more by visiting realitystudies.co. And if you appreciate the work I'm doing, please subscribe and share it with someone you think would enjoy it.